All right, good evening. I don't even have to stand all that close to the microphone tonight. Let's try that one more time. I heard a few. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Welcome to the fifth program of the Great Stone Viaduct Lecture Series and the second of these programs to be held in 70-degree plus weather. It's been quite a winter. We're thinking about renaming this the Great Stone Viaduct Winter-ish Lecture Series. But as always, thanks for coming out, especially when it's so beautiful outside. Thank you for coming inside and not staying outside and enjoying this weather. As you know, this is the 10th annual series in the library. As always, is grateful to partner with the Great Stone Viaduct Historical Education Series or Education Society for these programs. Even though it is warm outside, it's good to see so many of you here. But if you would choose to stay at home and enjoy this weather, you can always watch these programs online. We live stream them on Facebook and YouTube, and they are available to watch. The recordings are available to watch on our website the day following the programs. So for those of you who have not been to the library before, if you need to use the restrooms at any point, they're through the hall and take a left, and there's the women's on the right and the men's on the left. They're through that hallway. And then we do ask that, out of respect for our speaker tonight, that everybody please silence their cell phones at this time. For those of you who had kids or grandkids, bring them to the library on Thursday evenings at 5 p.m. or Friday mornings at 10 a.m. We have the little bookworms story time and craft with Miss Bree. And if you have kids or grandkids, ages newborns to 5, please sign them up for Dolly Parton's Imagination Library. It's a great program where kids can receive one free book in the mail every month until they turn at 5. It's no cost to the parents at all. And if you'd like to sponsor that great program, $25 gets one kid books for an entire year. There are brochures on the back tables for those two programs. There's also brochures on the back table for this series. We've got 3 more programs left. So pick up one of those brochures and come back next week and the following 2 weeks. And then finally, last week I mentioned that we're looking to start up a book club or 2 here at the library. So if you're interested in doing that, come see me. If you like history books and you want to talk to other like-minded people who like history, Jon-Erik here, who's our speaker tonight, has a book coming out, John Brown's Raid, and that will make a fantastic, excellent first book possibly for our book club if we want to do a history book club. So a little more about Jon-Erik Gilot, our speaker tonight. He's been fascinated with Harpers Ferry, which is why he wrote this book, John Brown's Raid, since his first visit as a child, so much so that he later proposed to his wife on Maryland Heights. He's a native of historic Mount Pleasant, Ohio, and he's spent more than 15 years in the fields of history and preservation. He works as an archivist and records manager in Wheeling, West Virginia. And since 2021, he's also served as the curator of the Captain Thomas S.B. Grand Army of the Republic Post in Carnegie, Pennsylvania. Outside of work, Jon-Erik is a historic landmarks commissioner with the city of Wheeling and a former board member of the West Virginia Independence, long-term board member of the West Virginia Independence Hall Foundation. As I mentioned, his book, John Brown's Raid, Harpers Ferry, and the Coming of the Civil War is scheduled for release in April 2023, next month. And he's going to tell us about one of the people that was from Belmont County that was part of John Brown's Raid tonight. So please welcome Jon-Erik Gilot.
Thanks for coming out tonight, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? I know I'm competing with good weather tonight, so thanks for coming out. Happy to be in Bellaire. I don't get to talk in Bellaire or the Ohio Valley all that often. I did just speak at Lunch with Books at the Ohio County Public Library a few weeks ago, but my grandfather was from Bellaire. I had a lot of family born here in Bellaire Hospital, so my roots are definitely here, even if I don't make it here that often. So like Aaron said, I'm an archivist and records manager in Wheeling, but on the weekends, and especially on the second Saturday of every month, you can find me up in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, just south of Pittsburgh. You could probably make it there in a little less than an hour from here at the Captain Thomas S.B. Post. And this was a post of the Grand Army of the Republic. That was a veterans organization of Union Army veterans after the Civil War, very much like you would think of the American Legion or the VFW today. There were about 7,500 locations, 7,500 unique GAR posts all over the country and around the world. But when the GAR died out in the late 1950s, that organization ceased to exist. All of these places went away. There was a post right here in Belair. There's no vestiges of it left that I'm aware of. But of those 7,500 posts, the Captain Thomas Espy post is considered the most intact remaining example of a Grand Army of the Republic post. And that's because when the veterans moved in there in 1906, they forged an agreement with the library that gave them free rent with the understanding that the veterans would outfit that room, and they made it into their own personal museum like you see here. But also that when the last veteran died, everything in that room would be turned over and preserved by the library for their children and their children's children as a testament for what they did during the war. So when the last veteran died in the late 1930s, that room was locked up. It was promptly forgotten about for about 50 years. Reopened in the late 1980s, fully restored in 2010, 2011. And today you can see the room exactly as the veterans left it. All of what you don't see in there, there's custom display cases all along the walls that the veterans filled with their artifacts, the things that they brought home from the Civil War, things that they collected after the war. And each item in there is numbered and identified. And in the veterans' own words, they tell us what makes it significant. You know, who carried it, what battle it was in, where they collected it afterwards. So it's really their own museum. And then to support the SB Post, on the second Saturday of every month, we have what's called a Second Saturday Civil War Lecture Series in the Lincoln Gallery, the room right next door. And believe it or not, these two guys you see here are respected Civil War historians. But we get historians in each month, and they talk to us about all kinds of aspects of the Civil War, authors, public historians, National Park Service rangers. So our next talk is actually going to be April 10th or March 10th, March 11th. Can't remember what that Saturday is. And that is a student from Duquesne University who will be speaking to us on the civilian stories of the Battle of Gettysburg. That's leading into our April one-day symposium where we have 5 speakers coming up. That symposium is sold out, but we do that every April. But either way, you know, every second Saturday of every month, January through June and September through November, these are free lectures, so you can come check those out. If you can't make it up to Carnegie, you can find us on Facebook or on our website, carnegie.org. And I do have some cards here. You can come up after. So we stream those talks on Zoom and on Facebook, and then we load the videos onto YouTube after. So we have a channel there with a bunch of talks. So there's bound to be something. If you're interested in history, American history, Civil War history, there's definitely going to be something there that would interest you. All right, so on to our topic tonight. So probably, you know, most of us are familiar, or we've at least heard of John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, right? You've probably heard something about it in school, or, you know, heard about it somewhere along the way. October 1859, considered one of the seminal cataclysmic events that really catapulted the United States towards Civil War. And if we have a visual of that raid, it's probably John Brown himself, right? That kind of icy stare, that flowing white beard. Maybe it's the engine house. If you visited Harpers Ferry, the engine house where John Brown holed up with his command, this was their Alamo. But, you know, I would contend next to John Brown, one of the most recognizable images or faces associated with John Brown's raid is this guy. That's Dangerfield Newby. And, you know, this is a haunting image. This was taken at a time when having your photograph taken meant something. You know, any one of us today, we can take out our cell phones and we can click, and take all the photos we want, and it's become mindless. But this image was thought out. This was composed. This image was made to speak to us across generations. So we're lucky that it was taken, because this is the only known surviving image of Dangerfield Newby, the topic of our talk tonight. So you'll see it many times tonight. So even if you didn't know who he was, you may have seen this photo before, or you may have seen some representation of him. The recent movie Emperor, he was featured in that, or he was depicted in that, came out in 2020. I haven't seen it yet, didn't get great reviews. So I don't know about that one. But Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained came out in 2012. It's always on TV now. The movie's a masterpiece. But the lead character in that is loosely based on Dangerfield Newby. The Good Lord Bird. I don't know if any of you saw that on Showtime a few years ago. Based off the novel, really interesting. I thought it was. I really enjoyed it. It's kind of interesting how movies and books pick, you know, what history they want to get right, and in this case, kind of the obscure stuff they really got right, or where they want to take their license, and they went they were wild on some of the stuff they had in here. His image has been used on album covers. There have been at least 2 bands that have been named after him, like the Dangerfield Newbies. He's been the topic of books and artwork. And then a Google search of Dangerfield Newby will turn up about 33,000 hits in just a fraction of a second. He has received a certain level of fame that he never sought out, never desired, and certainly could never have expected. So a few disclaimers before we really get into this topic tonight. If you haven't noticed, I do talk fast. I try not to, but I do. Later on, towards the end of the talk, we do get into some really grisly, really grim details. So if you ate an early dinner, or if you had any of the cookies over here, let's get that digested here as quickly as we can. And also, Erin has seen me speak a few times. She knows I like to interject some humor into my talks. I like to hear the room laughing with me, not at me. But tonight, there's just not a lot of humor in our talk here in this topic. Dangerfield Newby was just a man trying to save his family. And as you'll see, after exhausting all other means, Newby had to resort to any means necessary. Even then, showing more restraint than any one of us, and certainly myself, may have had we been in his situation. But his story, it's also among the most tragic, the most heart-wrenching of John Brown's raid. Newby was the oldest enlistee next to Brown himself, and Newby was fighting for far more personal reasons than the majority of his counterparts, who were, for the most part, impressionable young white men. And all of this from a guy who lived just a few miles up the river from here in Bridgeport, Ohio. But more than Dangerfield, it's also the story of a family and the lengths that family was willing to go to secure their freedom. So here's your spoiler alert. If you don't know how John Brown's raid ended, put on your earmuffs. All right. So October 18th, 1859, John Brown's raid is over. Brown is badly wounded in the final assault on the engine house. He is removed from the engine house over to the neighboring paymaster's office, where he is laid on the floor, and he is almost immediately interrogated by 2 politicians. It's Virginia Senator James M. Mason, who was a champion of slavery, and Clement Vallandigham. You might have heard his name before. He was a pro-slavery congressman from Ohio. These 2 thought that they could use Brown's raid to their political advantage. So even while the raid was still going on, they rushed over to Harpers Ferry to interrogate Brown about his connections to Ohio and to prominent abolitionists and politicians who were there, men like Joshua Giddings and Ben Wade, who were these politicians who had aligned themselves with this new Republican Party. It's a party whose platform stood against the expansion of slavery. So Vallandigham asked Brown, where were your men from in Ohio? Were any from the Western Reserve? Were any from Southern Ohio? And Brown was in severe pain from several of the wounds that he had received, but he was still forthright in his answers. And he replied, quote, yes, I believe one came from below Steubenville, down not far from Wheeling. Brown was here referring to our subject, Dangerfield Newby. And it was reading this transcript over 20 years ago that tipped me off that one of Brown's men had lived in my neighborhood. That probably says a lot about me, that I was spending my high school years reading John Brown transcripts instead of chasing girls. But Newby had only called our area of southeastern Ohio home for a short period. Dangerfield Newby was born around 1820 in Rappahannock County, Virginia, the son of Henry Newby, who was a white man, and Elsie Pollard, an enslaved woman from neighboring Fauquier County. Now, Henry's father, Edward, had built the Newby ancestral home at a place called Newby's Crossroads. That's near present-day Amosville, Virginia, that you see on the map here, in the 1770s. So Henry lived there until about 1830, when he sold the properties to his brothers, and he moved south a little ways to a property at Gourdvine in neighboring Culpeper County. Now, Elsie Pollard, she was 16 years younger than Henry Newby, and as a slave, she was owned by John Fox, who lived at Fauquier Springs in Fauquier County. Now, Fox was one of the largest slaveholders in Fauquier County. He owned about 200 slaves at one point, and he was known to rent them out to work at neighboring farms and plantations. So we can imagine that's perhaps how Henry and Elsie met. According to Elsie, she and Henry married in December 1818, and Dangerfield would be the first of at least 11 children born to this couple. Now, even though their father was a free white man, according to Virginia law at that time, any children born of an interracial couple assumed the race of the mother. So even though their father was free, Dangerfield and all of his siblings were born as the enslaved property of John Fox. And if you look at the dates here, you can see some gaps, and you can imagine that this couple had likely suffered some miscarriages or some infant mortality. There's 1840 to 1847. So you see several gaps there where they probably lost some additional children. Now, interracial marriage was against the law in Virginia at that time, so it's more likely that these two simply lived together as common law husband and wife. But think about that. Here is a white man living in a slave state who married a slave and raised a large family with her. You would think that this was so forward thinking for this time. But Henry was himself a slaveholder. We know that he owned at least 17 slaves in the 1850s, according to the 1850 census. Now, some of these we know were his children, who he eventually was able to purchase from Fox, and some of their children, his grandchildren, who he manumitted in September 1858. And now, to John Fox's credit, on his death in early 1859, he stipulated in his will that all of his slaves should be freed and good land purchased for them in Ohio. And that's because, according to Virginia law at that time, freed slaves must find a sponsor within 1 year of their manumission, or they must leave the state. Fox's estate wasn't settled until after the Civil War, when his property in Fauquier County was divided up into parcels for his former slaves to live on, at least those of them who could be located after the Civil War. Now, Dangerfield was skilled. He was a skilled slave. He was skilled in the trade of blacksmithing, and John Fox hired him out to work on the Rappahannock River Canal. That's down around the area of Fredericksburg, Virginia. He worked on some of the locks on that canal. At an unknown date, probably around 1840 to 1842, he married Harriet Jennings. She was a house slave who had belonged to Dr. Lewis A. Jennings, who was a physician in Fauquier County. Between 1843 and 1859, Harriet bore Dangerfield at least 7 children, again, all the property of the Jennings family. And again, if you look at the dates here, you can imagine that this couple likely lost a few more children with miscarriages or infant mortality. Now, in the fall of 1858, Henry Newby received permission from John Fox to move Elsie and their children to Ohio. And this is significant because only 2 years earlier, Ohio had set a legal precedent with the Supreme Court case, the Ohio Supreme Court case of Anderson versus Poindexter. The Ohio Supreme Court decided in favor of a slave from Kentucky who had been rented or leased out by his master to work in Ohio. And the Ohio Supreme Court said that by establishing a residence in Ohio, that slave had become free. The actual language of the ruling read that, quote, the chains of slavery would be, quote, broken and crumble to dust when he who has worn them obtains the liberty from his oppressor and is afforded the opportunity of placing his feet upon our shore and breathing the air of freedom. So in going to Ohio, as soon as Henry and Elsie and the children crossed the Ohio River at Wheeling and set up residence somewhere, they were free. So Henry sold his land in Culpeper County, and he took his family exactly the shortest distance they needed to go to ensure their freedom. And that was to Bridgeport, here in Belmont County. Now, I can't say for certain what brought them to Bridgeport, if Henry had friends or family or business interest here. I haven't been able to determine that yet. But what's interesting is that their trip from Virginia to Wheeling almost certainly took them through Harpers Ferry, where Dangerfield would find himself back in just a year later. But there was some risk in only going as far as Bridgeport. There was a slave market in Wheeling, or there had been a slave market in Wheeling. As far as I can tell, the only slave market located north of the Mason-Dixon line. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had empowered both slave owners and slave catchers to cross over state lines and retrieve their supposedly escaped property. And I say supposedly because these slave catchers were not above capturing free African Americans to send south into slavery. If you saw the recent movie 12 Years a Slave, that was a true story. That's what the premise was based on. We do have one account from William Wells Brown. He was himself a fugitive slave, later a prominent abolitionist. But Brown had visited an African American family at Short Creek, which is just across the Belmont border in Harrison County. Just a few years before this happened, just a few years before the Newbies arrived here. And Brown recorded how, quote, 5 or 6 men went into the house of a colored man by the name of John Wilkinson, broke open the door, knocked down the man and his wife and beat them severely, and seized the boy, aged 14 years, and carried him off into slavery. After the father of the boy had recovered himself, he raised the alarm, and with the aid of some neighbors put out in pursuit of the kidnappers and followed them to the river, but they were too late. Brown continues here. The villains crossed the river and passed into Virginia. I visited the afflicted family this morning. When I entered the house, I found the mother seated with her face buried in her hands, weeping for the loss of her child. The mother was much bruised, and the floor was covered in several places with blood. I was compelled to turn aside and weep for the first time since entering into the state. I would that every Northern apologist for slavery could have been present to behold the scene. Now, Belmont was a primarily agrarian county that for generations had put their goods to market on the Ohio River as far south as New Orleans. So as such, Belmont and this surrounding area of southeastern Ohio was much more closely aligned with the South and the West than they were with the North and the East. So what's that mean? Before the Civil War, that means Belmont was a very Democratic county. It was one of only a handful of Ohio counties that voted against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. It was one of even fewer Ohio counties that doubled down and voted against Lincoln again in 1864. The St. Clairsville Gazette, one of the most prominent Copperhead Democratic newspapers during the Civil War era, was from St. Clairsville in Belmont County. Being located on this border between North and South, given everything I just told you, while we know that there were communities in Belmont County who were very active on the Underground Railroad, it's more likely that the vast majority of this county may not have been as welcoming to the formerly or the recently enslaved. And this is where the Newby family put themselves. Now, even though Dangerfield was an adult by this point, his father still brought him here to Ohio, thereby, gaining Dangerfield's freedom. Obviously a good thing. But what Dangerfield lost in coming to Bridgeport was his wife Harriet and his children, who remained enslaved in Virginia. And even returning to Virginia to visit his wife and children would have been dangerous for Dangerfield. But we do know that he negotiated a price with Harriet's owner, Dr. Jennings, supposedly for $1,000 to purchase Harriet's freedom. So Dangerfield came here to Ohio and he got to work. We know he worked as a blacksmith. He made the acquaintance of a local congressman you see here, Thomas Thaker from Coleraine. And we know that Thaker wrote Newby a letter of recommendation. Now we know, why would he have needed a letter of recommendation? Well, we know that escaped slaves who came to this area would present themselves to some of the local sympathetic congregations, especially the Quakers, and beg for money. Now, you had several significant Quaker settlements here in eastern Ohio, including my hometown of Mount Pleasant. We have one account of a former slave, a man by the name of John Wilkerson, who in March 1858 visited the Hicksite Meeting House in Coleraine, just outside Mount Pleasant. And the account reads that, quote, Mr. Wilkerson lectured at the meeting house last night, and I think it was rather good. He gave us a description of his life. He was 21 years a slave. He said he ran away one day and showed us how he looked. He said he ran till night, and he found a hog trough where he slept. So we know that Dangerfield did the same as James Wilkerson, lecturing, begging for money to purchase his wife. And what money he raised, we know that he deposited in a Belmont savings bank, in the Belmont County Savings Bank. And now, just a moment ago, I told you that, Newby had supposedly agreed to purchase his wife's freedom for $1,000 because we never knew for certain. All the previous research done on Newby would tell you it was supposedly $1,000, but we don't have a contract. There's no bill of sale. Was it just for Harriet? Was it for Harriet and the children? Was it Harriet and some of the children? We never really knew. And everyone over the past 160 years has probably been referencing a handful of people who knew Dangerfield and their recollections of what it was, like his brother Gabriel, who also lived in Bridgeport, or John Brown's daughter, Annie Brown. They had recalled the price as $1,000. But back in December, a local historian, Angela Feenerty, sent me a newspaper article that she had found from a Caddis newspaper in late 1858. And as far as I can tell, this account has been overlooked over the past 164 years. And that's probably because Dangerfield Newby is not referenced by name. Dr. Jennings is not referenced by name. but Harriet, his wife, is referenced. And so there's no doubt in my mind that this letter relates to Dangerfield and Harriet. We don't know the author of this article, but the author did think to include a transcript of a letter written in Cadiz on October 1st, 1858. And the author of this article talks about being at the Harrison County Fair and meeting this former slave, Newbie, who was begging for money to purchase his wife. And to prove his story, Newbie produced a letter that was written to him by Harriet's owner. And the author of this article was so disturbed by the contents of this letter that he thought to take down a transcript so that he could publish it later. The author was clearly an abolitionist. So in this letter, Jennings writes, "Sir, I have received your letter asking if I would sell your wife Harriet and the two youngest children, and for how much. I don't think you care much for them, or you would not have preferred liberty to staying with them. But if you want to buy them, I will take $1,000 for Harriet, $150 for the babe, and $300 for the other, in all $1,450. You know I am poor and cannot in justice to myself and my family take less. How on earth can you raise that sum? If you could, they are better off where they are. If you like, I will buy you, or deposit the money in some bank and send me a certificate of deposit, and I will take you, your wife, and your children. P.S. Harriet sends her love." That $1,450 adjusted for today's inflation is about $52,000 he was asking. Now you can imagine how irate this must have made Newby. Jennings suggesting that Newby could never raise that amount, or that he might as well just return to slavery to unite his family. But here's a man the same age that I am standing before you, who had never known freedom for the whole 39 years of his life, who no doubt struggled with this opportunity of going to Ohio and gaining his freedom, or leave his family in Virginia. And here's this other man who's holding his wife and his children hostage, essentially, suggesting that Newby just instead return to slavery. I can't even imagine how that would make one feel. But that's a fascinating, really important letter that has never been out there before in John Brown's Raid or Dangerfield Newby research. And I was really thrilled that Angela was able to share that with me, and that I was able to share it with you. But we also know of 3 letters that were written by Harriet to Dangerfield in Bridgeport in 1859. And taken together, why are all of these letters significant? Well, it tells us that husband and wife, slave and formerly enslaved, were literate. They could read at a time when the vast majority of the enslaved could not. I've included a few transcripts here for you to read. While her spelling is rough, Harriet was an illustrative writer. Now, the first letter that we know of was written on April 11th, 1859, from Brentsville in Prince William County, Virginia. That's just south of Washington, D.C. Dr. Jennings had relocated his family there and took Harriet with him. Now, Harriet writes that her master's wife had been very ill and that Harriet was serving as a wet nurse. She told her husband that she and the children were well and that she wanted to see him very much, that she looked forward to the promised time of his coming. But she closed the letter saying, quote, "Oh, dear Dangerfield, come this fall without fail, money or no money. I want to see you so much. That is the one bright hope I have before me." Harriet wrote again less than 2 weeks later, imploring that, quote, "Dear Dangerfield, you cannot imagine how much I want to see you. Come as soon as you can, for nothing would give me more pleasure than to see you. It is the great comfort I have, thinking of that promised time when you will be here, that blessed hour when I shall see you once more." She told him how their youngest daughter, Lucy, who had been conceived before Dangerfield left for Ohio, had just started to crawl. So you can imagine that these letters are just pulling on Newby's heartstrings. But Newby wasn't actually in Bridgeport to receive the letters. He had been working up in northeastern Ohio, Ashtabula County, still trying to raise money to buy Harriet. But his brother Gabriel here in Bridgeport would receive the letters from Harriet and forward them on up to Ashtabula to Dangerfield. But by August 1859, Dangerfield Newby was running out of time. He couldn't wait any longer. He received a final letter from Harriet dated August 16th, 1859, and this letter had a sense of urgency to it. Harriet wrote that, quote, "I want you to buy me as soon as possible, for if you do not get me, somebody else will. The servants are very disagreeable. They do all they can to set my mistress against me. She continues here, quote, "Dear husband, you know not the trouble I see. The last 2 years have been like a troubled dream to me. It is said, master is in want of money. If so, I know not what time he may sell me, and then all my bright hopes for the future are blasted. For there has been but one bright hope to cheer me in all my troubles, and this is to be with you. For if I thought I should never see you, this earth would have no charms for me. Do all you can for me, which I have no doubt you will. Write soon and say when you think you can come." Now, there's some disagreement as to whether Harriet actually wrote these letters. A later census enumerates Harriet as illiterate. So it's possible that she was dictating these letters to someone else who then wrote them down, or that the later census enumerator made a mistake. Regardless, the letters were genuine. These were found in a carpet bag at the Kennedy Farmhouse following John Brown's raid. They were quickly published by the state of Virginia with other documents relative to the raid. So they are official state documents now. You can still find the transcripts online today. But the originals, we believe, were lost. There's one account that suggests the originals were destroyed in the evacuation of Richmond in April 1865. Regardless of who wrote the letters, Dangerfield had raised about $750 of the $1,450 he needed, and now time was not on his side. You can see an inventory here. It's not a great scan, but it's an inventory of Dangerfield's estate, showing that between December 1858 and March of 1859, he had deposited several CDs in the Belmont Savings Bank. Sources disagree on exactly what happened with Dr. Jennings. Maybe Jennings raised the price, or Jennings broke off the deal. Regardless, we do know that those negotiations broke down, and Dangerfield needed to act now if he was going to save his wife and his children. And it was up there in Ashtabula County that Dangerfield made the acquaintance of John Brown Jr., John Brown's son, who was then recruiting troops for his father's war against slavery. Now, we don't have time to go into a fuller background of John Brown. That could be a program in and of itself. But I'm sure most of you have at least heard of him. John Brown was a radical abolitionist who from a young age had learned to despise slavery. Following the 1837 murder of abolitionist printer Elijah P. Lovejoy, Brown rose at a church service and publicly declared that, quote, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." And Brown truly made it his life's work. He later relocated his family to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he founded the League of Gileadites. That was a militant organization aimed at protecting the local African-American population from slave catchers. He made the acquaintance of abolitionist luminaries like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. He later moved his family up into the Adirondack Mountains, where they helped to launch an African-American colony at a place called New Elba. Brown thought he was a biblical man, and he thought slavery was an affront to God. And Brown was willing to wage a biblical war to, quote, "break the jaws of the wicked and pluck the spoils out of his teeth." So at the urging of his sons, Brown moved west to Kansas in 1855, where during a period known as Bleeding Kansas, he openly battled pro-slavery militants from Missouri who had crossed over into Kansas and were determined to see Kansas admitted to the Union as a slave state. Next to Harpers Ferry, the one thing people most know about John Brown happened out in Kansas, where on May 24th, 1856, Brown directed the murder of 5 pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek. So Brown was determined to, as he called it, quote, "carry the war into Africa." And by that, he meant the slaveholding states. And he had identified Harpers Ferry, Virginia, as his target, as this target of his growing army. And honestly, Harpers Ferry was not a terrible choice. There were thousands of weapons that were stored there in the federal armory and arsenal. There were more than 21,000 slaves in the counties immediately surrounding Harpers Ferry in Virginia and Maryland. And Brown hoped to use this, if you've been to Harpers Ferry before, you know it's kind of mountainous country. And he hoped to use that mountainous terrain to launch what he called lightning strikes against slaveholders, where he would fall on a farm or plantation overnight and steal away with their slaves into the mountains. Brown hoped that in stealing these slaves from these local farms, that he would destabilize the slave economy in the Upper South, that he would make it untenable for slave owners to keep their investment there for risk of losing them, for fear of losing them to Brown. And he thought that if he could drive slavery from just one county in Virginia, that would weaken the institution of slavery throughout the entire state, thereby weakening it throughout the South. So Harpers Ferry would be Brown's first blow to end slavery in the United States. And if Brown's strike were successful and Newby joined him, that would put Newby just about 60 miles away from his wife and his children at Brentsville. So in early July 1859, Brown rented a farmhouse in Washington County, Maryland, just across the Potomac River from Harpers Ferry, and he there began consolidating his army of recruits. Now, Brown's army would only consist of 21 men, ranging in age from 21 to 39. Like I'd mentioned, Newby being 39, being the oldest enlistee next to Brown himself. That included 16 white men and 5 African Americans. Here you see the Kennedy Farmhouse as it appeared at that time, and as it appears today. It is a historic site just a few miles from Harpers Ferry. I'd really encourage you, if any of you are in the Harpers Ferry area, run across the river there and check out the Kennedy Farmhouse. It's a really moving, a really beautiful site. Now, Newby was one of the very last enlistees to arrive at the Kennedy Farmhouse, probably late August, more likely early September 1859. But it's here during this time at the farmhouse that we get a glimpse into Dangerfield Newby, the man. His brother, Gabriel Newby, recalled that Dangerfield was, quote, a quiet man, upright, quick-tempered, and devoted to his family. He never talked much about slavery and kept his intentions of joining John Brown to himself. Another source describes Newby as light-skinned and tall for his day, standing about 6'2". John Brown's daughter, Annie Brown, relocated down to the Kennedy Farmhouse in the summer of 1859 to keep house for all of these men and to keep up appearances. It was good to have a woman on site. But she recalled Newby was, quote, quiet, sensible, and very unobtrusive, and that he was, quote, a splendid light-skinned specimen. She recalled that Newby would get very low-spirited and impatient at what appeared to him to be a long delay in the preparations and planning for the raid. She recalled that everyone there was fond of Newby, and they would try to cheer him up. And now most of Brown's raiders were confined to the Kennedy Farmhouse during this period. They didn't have freedom to go out. They were confined to an attic or loft space. They would typically only get out overnight during thunderstorms when they could go outside and make some noise and weren't afraid of people coming by seeing what they were up to at this farmhouse. But Newby did have a bit more freedom. He was able to go out and work at a neighboring farm during his time there. Annie also recalled that Newby spent time familiarizing himself with a provisional constitution that her father had outlined a year earlier. This was a constitution that Brown envisioned would govern this new state of escaped slaves somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. And she recalled that Newby was especially taken with Article 42 of this Constitution, which noted that, quote, the marriage relation shall be at all times respected and families kept together as far as possible, and broken families encouraged to unite with intelligence offices established for this purpose. So you can understand why Newby would have been especially taken with this language. He was himself trying to reunite his broken family. Now, there's reason to believe that Newby was trying to recruit his younger brothers, Gabriel and James, who were here in Bridgeport, to join with him at the Kennedy Farmhouse. We know that both Dangerfield and Gabriel were active on the Underground Railroad in Ohio. And while Dangerfield wrote to his brothers in Bridgeport and encouraged them to join him at the Kennedy Farmhouse, he did not indicate a purpose, and neither one made the trip. So after many delays and financial exigencies and all kinds of things, even a near mutiny, on the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown put his plan into motion, telling his men, quote, get on your arms, we will proceed to the ferry. And he put his army on the road to Harpers Ferry and on the road to destiny. At first, things went well. Brown's men slipped into town. They captured the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge leading into town. They cut the telegraph lines. They captured the armory watchmen. By 11 p.m., they had possession of the federal armory. Let's just slide ahead. Brown's men, they fanned out across town, as you can see here on this map. Groups of his men captured, let's see here. Do I have a pointer on here? Maybe I don't. Oh, there's. So they came down the C&O towpath here. They captured the Baltimore and Ohio Bridge. They went down here into the Armory. A group came over here to the Arsenal. Another group came over to hold the Shenandoah River Bridge, the bridge of the Shenandoah River. Another group went about a mile upriver to the site of Hall's Rifle Works. So it was a rifle factory. So they were really spreading out across town here. Brown also sent out a group of men to take some hostages out into the country. And one of those hostages included Lewis Washington, a great nephew of George Washington, also a cousin to some of the Washingtons who lived in Wheeling. Everything changed about 1:30 the following morning. That's when a Baltimore and Ohio Express train that was traveling from Wheeling to Baltimore pulled into town. The conductor and his crew, they were very confused why they weren't met by a bridge watchman. That was covered B&O bridge that was leading in and out of town. And typically there would be a watchman there that would ensure there were no obstructions on the tracks, that would tell a train that it was safe to go, or that would guide the train through the bridge. But there was no one there to meet them. So the conductor and his crew got out to investigate. On detraining, they were met by a night watchman who informed the conductor that he had been attacked. So the watchman, the conductor, and the local baggage master, a guy by the name of Hayward Shepherd, they cautiously entered into this dark bridge. Brown had several men stationed at the bridge, including his son Oliver and William Thompson, who was a brother to Brown's son-in-law. These men called out for the train crew to halt. Naturally, the crew turned around and tried to run out of the bridge when shots rang out and Hayward Shepherd was struck just below the heart. The first casualty of John Brown's war to end slavery was himself a free African American. More gunshots started to awaken the citizens around Harpers Ferry. Riders were sent out to nearby Shepherdstown and Charlestown to put the local militias on notice that some kind of trouble was brewing at Harpers Ferry. They didn't know what was going on yet. So Brown actually offered to let the train pass, but the conductor didn't feel that it was safe. He thought the bridge might be booby-trapped, that Brown would send the train careening off into the river. So the train actually sat there in Harpers Ferry until 6:30 the following morning, when the conductor finally felt it was safe to leave. This B&O train from Wheeling to Baltimore is what truly ensured Brown's downfall, because the conductor stopped at Monocacy Junction, just down the line, where he found the telegraph lines were still open, and he sent telegraphs down the line that abolitionists had invaded Harpers Ferry. This was the first alarm to the outside world, outside the immediate community around Harpers Ferry, that all was not well. About 7 a.m. that morning, another Harpers Ferry resident, a guy by the name of Thomas Borley, was shot and killed while trading fire with Brown's men. His death, by some accounts, was at the hands of a shot from Dangerfield Newby. Another citizen's death, a guy by the name of George Turner, really popular guy, really outraged the citizens. He was killed at the intersection of Shenandoah and High Streets. His death, again, is sometimes assigned to Dangerfield Newby. So these Harpers Ferry citizens were enraged. They had no idea who these men were, what they were doing in their town. And during all of this, Dangerfield Newby had been stationed with Osborne Anderson, another free African-American from Canada, and Oliver and John Brown's son, Oliver. And they were stationed at the Arsenal, which was near the entrance to the B&O covered bridge that you see here. This is down in the area where John Brown's fort sits today. The fort is not in the original location. It's been moved several times. So if you're visiting the fort, you're actually within the site of the Arsenal where Newby was stationed. So angry citizens and militia companies started to show up, and they started to press Brown's men where they were stationed all around town. About noon on the 17th, several militia companies launched a coordinated assault against Brown's men. So here, pointer here, you have a company from Charlestown, the Jefferson Guards. They actually went up the Potomac River up here about a mile and crossed the river, and they're coming down the C&O Canal towpath here and crossing over the Baltimore and Ohio Bridge. You had a group from Martinsburg, the Martinsburg Militia, coming down and assaulting down the Armory complex. You had the Shepherdstown Militia coming straight down High Street. You had men from Bolivar, the town right above Harpers Ferry, that were attacking Brown's men at Hall's Rifle Works. And then you had local Harpers Ferry civilians who crossed upriver, the Shenandoah River, and were attacking Brown's men across the Shenandoah Bridge. They were trying to hem in Brown's command. So on seeing what was going on here, Brown started to call in some of his outposts back to their Alamo, back to the engine house, to put up a defense there to drive back these assaults. So Newby and Oliver Brown and Osborne Anderson, they went across the street over to the armory and helped to kind of beat back this assault. They did succeed in some extent, but the militiamen who were coming across the B&O Bridge here, they retreated back into the bridge, but they didn't give the bridge back up to Brown and his men. At this point, Brown's lifeline to points north had been cut. He was stuck. So Newby and Anderson, after beating back this assault, they were running back across the street to the federal arsenal when Newby was struck with a shot in the abdomen. He collapsed into the street. He managed to return fire, but here he was shot for the second time from the upstairs window of a building right here on the corner. If you visit Harpers Ferry today, the building is still there. And I want to say there's like a Potomac wetlands exhibit. It is a museum building. But a shot was fired from the third floor of that building. And here at this point, with his second wound, Dangerfield Newby became the first casualty of John Brown's Provisional Army. The shot that hit him was apparently a small iron spike. It struck Newby in the neck, and it cut his throat, quote, from ear to ear. The Harpers Ferry men, the civilians, people were fighting back with whatever they could find. Brown and his men, they had control of the armory. They had control of the arsenal. There was not a lot of other ammunition around town. They were fighting back with anything they could get their hands on. One witness recalled that, quote, I saw his body while it was yet warm as it lay on the pavement in front of the arsenal yard, and I never saw on any battlefield a more hideous musket wound than his. Another witness claimed the wound in Newby's neck was gaping open quite large enough to admit the forepart of an ordinary-sized foot. So at this point, Dangerfield Newby's body became something of a morbid spectacle. Enraged citizens dragged Newby's body from where he fell into a nearby gutter. So you can kind of see here, Newby fell here right around the intersection of Shenandoah and High Streets. They dragged his body up here into an alley. Today, that's known as Hog Alley. It's still there. But in this area, they had a little more cover from the rifle fire that was going on around town. But here in the gutter in this alley, they began mutilating and dismembering Newby's corpse. Or as one newspaper put it, Newby's body was, quote, exposed to every indignity that could be heaped upon it. His ears and his genitals were cut off as souvenirs. A newspaper correspondent recalled seeing people running sticks into Newby's wound and beating his corpse. Another citizen walked up and fired a shot into Newby's lifeless body, while another kicked Newby's face. His body was afforded no more dignity than, quote, any other dead animal. Another Harpers Ferry resident wrote that, quote, shortly after Newby's death, a hog came up and rooted around the body, and at first appeared unconscious that anything extraordinary was in its way. And after a while, the hog paused and looked at the body and then snuffed around it and put its snout to the dead man's face. Suddenly, the brute was apparently seized with a panic and scampered away as if for dear life. This display of sensibility did not, however, deter others of the same species from crowding around the corpse and almost literally devouring it. One Maryland journalist observed the same scene, writing that, quote, the king of terrors himself could not exceed those hogs in zealous attention to the defunct Newby. They tugged away at him with might and main, and the writer saw one run its snout into the wound and drag out a stringy substance of some kind. It appeared to be very long or elastic, one end being in the hog's mouth and another in the man's body. I told you it was grisly. So that was the end of Dangerfield Newby, a man simply trying to reunite his family. John Brown's raid came to a bloody end the following morning when Brown and his survivors were stormed in the engine house by a detachment of United States Marines led by Colonel and future Confederate General Robert E. Lee. 10 of Brown's men were killed during the raid, including Newby. 5 escaped from Harpers Ferry, and 7, including John Brown, were captured. Now, Brown and his captured compatriots were tried in nearby Charlestown, where they were quickly found guilty of murder, treason, and inciting insurrection. And as much as the raid itself, this trial brought the United States even closer to civil war. This was the first trial of its day to receive national reporting. This was exhaustive newspaper coverage. Today we think of front page, above the fold. At that time, that was typically reserved for literature and stuff. You found the real news on page 2. But just exhaustive coverage. And this really forced people, both North and South, to take sides on slavery. After John Brown, a white man willing to die for the slave, there was no more remaining ambivalent. You had to take sides. John Brown was hanged on December 2nd, 1859, passing his jailer a note on the way to the gallows, reading, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might be done." You can see in this image here, this is a sketch taken at the execution, taken at the gallows site. And right down here in the front row, this was the Virginia State Fencibles, also known as the Wheeling Fencibles. Wheeling sent 2 militia companies to be present for state duty at the execution. And the Fencibles were given what was considered a position of honor in the front row. And this gentleman up here, you see George Trimble. He was a member of the Fencibles wearing their uniform. And during the course of my research here for this book, I received the payrolls for the Virginia Fencibles and the other Wheeling Militia Company, the German Rifles, from the Virginia State Library. And I found I had an ancestor who was a member of the Fencibles, who actually lived here in Belmont County in West Wheeling. And he was present at John Brown's raid as a member of the Fencibles. I had absolutely no idea. Some people tend to write off John Brown as a fanatic, as a terrorist, maybe that he was mentally ill. Whatever you think of him, he was also prophetically accurate. In one year, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The southern states would secede from the Union, and the country would see about 750,000 deaths over the resulting 4 years before slavery was finally purged away. As for Dangerfield Newby, his body was left on the streets of Harpers Ferry until October 19th, when he and the other Brown's raiders who were killed during the raid were buried in an unmarked mass grave along the Shenandoah River that you see here. They remained there until 1899, when one evening in the dark of night, the grave was quietly disinterred and the remains were shipped north to North Elba, where they were reburied next to their captain, John Brown, which you see in the other image there. But Newby's story doesn't end with a desecrated corpse in a gutter at Harpers Ferry. When word reached back here to the Upper Ohio Valley that one of our own had been involved in John Brown's raid, 3 men grabbed up Dangerfield's brother Gabriel and nearly beat him to death on the streets of Bridgeport, Ohio. These men were arrested, they were fined, and they were sentenced to hard labor on a ball and chain. One local newspaper reported that, quote, "It is true, we suppose, that Gabriel Newby is a brother to him who was killed at Harpers Ferry, but we do not believe that fact should operate in any degree as a license to drunken ruffians to beat his brains out." If you can read the article, it states that the men were fined $30 and $17 and had to work that fine off at the rate of 75 cents a day. That's 40 days and 23 days hard labor on a ball and chain for an attack on a black man in an overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly Democratic neighborhood. That should give you an idea of just how vicious this assault must have been. It's also worth noting 2 of these 3 men later went on to enlist in the Union Army. We can imagine that for their own part, they may not have been fighting a war to end slavery. Newby's family carried on Dangerfield's fight for freedom during the Civil War. Gabriel served as a camp servant for the colonel in the 98th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He remained something of a local celebrity until his death in 1900. I don't have any proof, but I have to wonder if the beating that he took was so severe that it might have kept him from enlisting as a regular soldier, because several of his younger brothers did. James Newby enlisted in Wheeling in the 45th United States Colored Volunteer Infantry and served until November 1865, going all the way to Texas with that regiment. The 45th was the only USCT regiment credited to the state of West Virginia during the Civil War. About 300 men from that regiment had enlisted in places like Wheeling and Parkersburg and Huntington. The rest of the regiment came from over around Philadelphia. Younger brothers John and William Newby both served in the 5th United States Colored Infantry. John survived the war. William was wounded at the Battle of Petersburg, Virginia. He died of those wounds at Governor's Island, New York on July 26, 1864. And you see his grave there where he's buried in the National Cemetery. Dangerfield also had a nephew from Bridgeport, a guy by the name of Lafayette Bywater, who also served in the 45th USCT. The Bywater family, at least, still has descendants living locally in our community. Several of the Newbies, including Gabriel and Dangerfield's parents, his father died in 1861 and his mother in 1884. They're buried in Weeks Cemetery on the hill up above Bridgeport. I've looked for years to see if I could find markers for them in that cemetery, and I've never found anything. So either they're weathered or they've sunken down into the ground or they're in unmarked graves. And either way, it's a real shame. But finally, in conclusion here, what about Dangerfield's wife and children? The following year, Harriet Newby's worst dreams were realized when she and several of the children were sold to a plantation in Louisiana. They were sold down the river. In 1862, which you see in the article here, Dangerfield's siblings filed suit in Belmont County to recover the money that he had left sitting in the Belmont Savings Bank. But because his wife and several of the children had been sold, they were not able to present themselves here in Belmont County to contest the suit, so the funds were awarded to his siblings. Harriet later remarried. She met her second husband, a guy by the name of William Robinson, in a Freedmen's Bureau camp in Louisiana. She had 3 more children with him. Her husband had been born a slave in Shepherdstown, Virginia. That's just about a dozen miles from Harpers Ferry. So he certainly would have been familiar with this raid in which her husband had participated in, her previous husband. The couple later moved back to Virginia, to Fairfax County. William actually worked as a groundskeeper at Mount Vernon. Harriet died in 1884. The last surviving child of Dangerfield and Harriet that we know of, that we can trace, died in 1926. That's less than 100 years ago. And there's people here living in our community who are older than 100 years old, who were alive at the same time as these people's children. So we're not that far removed from these stories, even if it seems like a long time ago. But John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, like I said, it was one of those seminal cataclysmic events in our nation's history. And Dangerfield Newby was a big part of that story. We have many, many local connections to John Brown's raid all over this Ohio Valley. But Newby, having lived here, even if only a short time, he is the most visceral connection that we have to that story. And Dangerfield's story demonstrates to us really the tremendous cost of slavery. For someone like Newby, it cost him his wife, it cost him his children, it cost him his life. And it demonstrates the lengths that just one man was willing to go to reunite his fractured family. So like Aaron mentioned, I really wanted to have my book here with you today because I really need to sell some copies. But it's at the printer right now. It's supposed to be in my hands by the middle of April. And so I'd love to come back some other time and maybe talk more about John Brown, maybe sell you a book. But it's part of the Emerging Civil War series published by Savas Beatty. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at the publisher's website, savasbeatty.com. The book follows John Brown from childhood up through the raid, the execution, his legacy. There's a walking tour of sites in the lower town of Harpers Ferry that are associated with John Brown's raid, and a driving tour that takes you from the Kennedy Farmhouse up through Harpers Ferry and to Charlestown, where Brown was tried and ultimately executed. So there's all kinds of good stuff for you there. If you aren't familiar with Emerging Civil War, it's a group of young younger, I'm not too young anymore, public, academic, independent historians. We publish new Civil War content on our website at least 2 times a day and at least 5 days a week, all of it free. We have several book series out. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, all of that. But I've got business cards up here. I'd love for you to visit our website, and you can find all kinds of stuff there, including a lot of local Ohio Valley history that I have published there as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has, but I thank you for coming out on a really beautiful night. Thank you for having me. Yes, sir.
Was geography the only reason that Harpers Ferry became such a seminal location? Was it just the geography, or was it
Just the well, no. I mean, it was one of only 2 federal armories or arsenals that had been established by that time. The other in Springfield, Massachusetts. It was a transportation hub. You had 2 railroads going through there. You had a canal. Really, and geography played a big part of it there, though, with the rivers. It factored into being a transportation hub. And that's why the Civil War had such an impact. The armies were always trying to control Harpers Ferry because you control the roads, you can control the railroads, the canal. It was a really strategic point. Yes, sir.
how did John Brown expect to be the regional force? I mean, was it always my understanding that he believed that there was going to be a general uprising around the area that would support the government from those slaves who were in the area?
He ended up getting away from his plan. So like I said, he'd planned these lightning raids where he would go to a farm or a plantation and steal away the slaves at night and retreat back into the mountains. He wanted to fight on the defensive only. At some point, he changed his mind and he decided to occupy the arsenal, thinking that the slaves were going to come rally to him, that he would send word out. That's why he sent men out into the countryside to take hostages. But they were also telling slaves, go tell your friends, we're here to liberate you, spread the word. So some slaves did rise up, not as many as he was thinking. But so he was expecting them to come to him. In the end, it didn't happen in the numbers that he was thinking, but then his lifeline up to the north got cut. He wanted them to come to him where he could then fall back in the mountains. He had supplies to fight essentially a guerrilla war in the mountains if he were attacked. That's what he was doing in Harpers Ferry. He wanted to fight from fortified positions, and he had good weapons there. He had Sharp's carbines. They're quick to reload, fire multiple shots very quickly. Actually better than some of the weapons that they were creating in Harpers Ferry, the single-shot Springfield rifles. So he felt confident that if they were coming to him, he could get back across the mountains, arm them, and fight on the defensive. It just didn't happen. He got wrapped up taking care of his prisoners. Militias showed up, cut off his avenues of escape, and he was stuck. He kept trying to negotiate the whole time he was there. Once he realized he was stuck, he was trying to negotiate from a position of power, thinking that he could get out of there. And the militia companies and then ultimately Robert E. Lee and the Marines were not having any of it. They knew they had him confined.
So he was trying to get the weaponry and transport it back out of his home.
We don't. There's not really There's not good evidence to support that. Brown brought a wagon to Harpers Ferry with him. When he was captured, he didn't have any of his men during the time he was there. None of them were making arrangements to load up weapons into a wagon or to get weapons from out of town. He thought his weapons were superior to what they had there. He also had pikes made, one of the most recognizable symbols of the raid. He had these pikes made that he intended to arm the slaves with. But he had additional weapons stored at the Kennedy Farmhouse. And at some point, he called for those to be brought down closer to Harpers Ferry. Those never made it there. A lot of people think because he was going after the arsenal and the armory that he was trying to use those weapons to arm the slaves. He just wasn't making any. If he hadn't made any plans to do it while he was there.
So it was like a religious fanaticism against slavery.
Well, it was. He was no fan of the president, James Buchanan, or the government, any government that would create laws that would support and continue slavery. So I think at one point after he had directed the murders of the men at Pottawatomie Creek, there was a bounty that was a federal bounty that was placed on John Brown's head. And if I remember, I think it was $250. And Brown quipped that, I'll give $2.50 for the president of the United States for his head to be brought to me. So he was no fan. So this was a federal presence. There was also a federal armory in Missouri that while he was in Kansas, pro-slavery men raided a federal arsenal at Liberty, Missouri, took all the weapons out of there and were planning to use those weapons against the free soil settlers in Kansas. So he was familiar with these pro-slavery men who had raided a federal arsenal, and that might have been some inspiration for what he did at Harpers Ferry as well. Yes?
Before General Lee's or Robert A. Lee's 90 Marines showed up the next day on the 18th.
Yeah, there
were they both dispatched at the same time, and because the distance from D.C. to Harpers Ferry was, well, by today's highway, is about 70 miles. Is it just that the militias were closer? They showed up sooner. The Marines finally came and said, "Let's put it in."
Yeah, the militias were closer. It was all from local communities. There were more that tried to get down there and didn't make it in time, a group from Frederick and several others. So they were closer. It took them a while to get on the same page with these coordinated assaults, trying to figure out, all right, who's going to lead all of these disparate companies. But there was a lot of whiskey going around Harpers Ferry. These men were getting drunk. They were taking pot shots. It was a bad place to be. And the more the night went on, the drunker these guys got. The militia and the citizens, yeah. The more it went on, the angrier they got. And as several of the militiamen were wounded, several of the townspeople were killed. It just got to be a bad scene. Several of Brown's men were essentially murdered or executed. You'll hear stories about one, William Lehman. He was trying to swim across the Potomac River, and one of the militiamen swam out and killed him on a rock in the middle of the river, and then his body was used there for target practice. It was an ugly scene that night. And then Lee very quickly started to gain control. He wouldn't take any more militia coming down. I think the group from Frederick, he stopped at Sandy Hook, and so he came in, took stock of the situation, figured out what was going on, got the militias under control, and then he was in charge from there on out. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just going to make a statement. I just heard a program a few days ago on public radio. All federal places where they've been named after the Southern general heroes.
Yeah.
Those names are going to be removed all over the United States.
Yes, I heard that as well. Yeah.
They were all treasonous.
Well, I mean, yeah, I won't get into the politics of that, but I will say some of those bases, they could have picked some better, even Confederate generals to name them after. Braxton Bragg was no great general by any stretch. And yeah, you had several like that. So they could have picked a few better names, but yeah, I did hear that as well. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Will you help us?
Thank you. Perfect.
And then would you help us with our drawing? So the
One
first
of each?
One of each, yes. All right, the first one is the white ticket for the charcuterie board, and it is 6609880. White ticket. All right. And then we have the blue ticket door prize, and you can get anything on the table. It is 9532477. 9532477. Whenever you're ready, you can pick something up. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. Another round of applause for our speaker. We just want to thank you all so much. We're a little bit more than halfway through the lecture series, but we do want to just honor someone tonight. One of our frequent lecture attendees, Colleen Willis, passed away, and we just want to keep her family in our thoughts and prayers. And we'll miss her now. She was always one of our speaker guests, and we love to see her here. So we just keep her family in our prayers and sympathies. So thank you all so much for coming this evening, and thank you so much. And we will see you next week. Thank you.